Good day, and welcome to the Resource Productivity and Recovery Authority's All About PROS webinar. At this time, all lines have been placed in a listen-only mode. You can submit questions during the presentation by using the Q&A tool located to the right of the slides. Now, I would like to introduce Ellen White, RPRA Communication Advisor. Ellen, please go ahead.
Thanks, Tammy, and thank you to everyone for joining this morning's webinar all about PROS. In a moment, I'm going to be handing it over to our registrar, Pat Moran, who will be leading today's session. But before I do, I wanted to go over just a few housekeeping rules. The first one is, as Tammy mentioned, we have around 157 people registered for today's webinar, so we are going to be taking written questions only. That helps us manage the flow of questions and make sure that we can answer as many questions as possible. To do so, you're going to type your question into the question box and hit enter. And we have several breaks within the presentation where we're going to pause and take questions, so we'll answer them at that time. This is also the box you're going to use if you're having any technical issues, and Tammy will be able to help you with those. So today's session is going to be recorded, so if you wanted to go back and review it, we're going to be posting it to our website, and we'll let you know the link when it's posted. As well, we're going to be repeating this webinar tomorrow for those people who your friends and colleagues who weren't able to make it today. They can join us tomorrow, Thursday, September 19th at 2 p.m. It's going to be the exact same session, but if you have a question that wasn't answered today and you wanted to join us tomorrow, you're more than welcome. The topic of today's presentation is about producer responsibility organizations, but I did want to quickly mention that we're also having a couple upcoming webinars specifically for our collectors, haulers, retreaders, and processors as a Q&A on how to register with the RPRA. So information about registering for those are on our website at rpra.ca, but I'll just let you know that they're going to be in October. One is on October 2nd and one is on October 10th. So without any further ado, I'll hand it over to Pat Moran.
Thanks very much, Ellen, and thank you very much for everybody who's participating today and giving us the opportunity to talk about the very important topic of producer responsibility organizations and the role they play in the recycling of tires. So my presentation today, as Ellen indicated, is going to have several stop points for questions coming up, and but the topics I'm going to address over the next little while will start with who are the players in the recycling world, what can a pro do for producers, how does a pro work with collectors and haulers and processors and retreaders and producers, and how do I go about finding a pro if I'm a producer. So we'll start off with the authority. We're a regulatory body that was created by the Ontario government under the Resource Recovery and Circular Economy Act. And as a regulator, our job is to implement an electronic registry that becomes available for people who have to register because they've been told they have to under regulations, and then a series of regulations are issued by the ministry that we implement, and then we monitor compliance, and when it becomes necessary, we will take compliance steps and enforcement steps to ensure compliance. I'd like to note at this point that one of the things that we're not doing is replacing the Ontario Tire Stewardship. OTS was not a regulator. It was in the business of organizing collection and recycling of tires through contractual relationships with all the service providers and the producers, and we're not doing any of that. So we will not be entering into contracts with producers. We will not be entering into contracts with collectors or haulers or processors or retreaders. We will not be collecting any money from producers to pay service providers. And we won't be paying incentives to service providers. Those are all activities that OTS was involved in, and that activity is now going to be delivered by other people called producer responsibility organizations or pros, unless you choose as a producer to engage in these activities directly yourself. And we'll get into what that means a little bit later on. The other thing that I would note, even though it's not on this slide, is that the people who have to report into the registry have to do that on an annual basis. We know that OTS had a system of monthly reporting. We don't know what kind of reporting system the pros are going to be implementing. We know a lot of them are going to use some version of trademarks and to continue something that is familiar to service providers. But our annual reporting requirements are completely separate and completely different from what happens in the marketplace. The next major group of players are, of course, the producers. So under the new circular economy model, producers are now responsible on an individual basis for meeting collection and recycling tires for the tires that they are producers for, which then raises the question, well, what tires am I the producer for? There are two categories of tire producers. There's the people who sell loose tires into the market, and there's the people who sell new vehicles with new tires into the market in Ontario. And the approach to who a producer is basically the same in both of those contexts. It's based on a hierarchy, and it starts with either the brand holder for the tires or the manufacturer of the vehicles. If those people are resident in Ontario, they are the producers for the tires or the cars that they're supplying into the Ontario market. The next level is, if there isn't a brand holder or a manufacturer, is whether there's a resident importer for tires or vehicles. And if you're the resident importer or the resident importer of vehicles or tires supplied into Ontario, then you will be the producer for those tires and those vehicles. That person isn't available because the person who's importing them is outside of Ontario, then the first resident person that markets either the tires or the vehicles into Ontario becomes the producer for those tires, et cetera. And then at the bottom of the hierarchy is where there's a non-resident marketer who's selling into the Ontario market directly to a consumer. So those are the producers, and we've seen from the registration process for producers that some producers can occupy a number of those categories. And for example, a lot of producers are a resident brand holder and a resident importer because not all of the tires or not all of the vehicles that they manufacture in Ontario are counted as the tires that they are responsible for. They also import some of those tires. Anyway, there's lots of help available to people who want more definition on whether they are a producer or not on our registry, and our registry officers, of course, are always standing by to help anybody who's got questions on that. Then we've got the service providers. So these are the collectors, the people who actually collect used tires, the haulers, the people who pick up the tires from the collectors and bring them to the retreaders who are going to retread them, or the processors who are going to process them. Those are that's the main group of service providers that are also required to register. Important to note that you can be a producer and a collector. This, of course, happens very frequently in the context of tires because a lot of tire dealers are selling new tires to consumers, and they're putting those new tires on the consumers' cars and obviously taking back the used tires. And they may be a producer for some of those tires, so they would be a producer and a collector in that context. We haven't seen anybody who's both a producer and a hauler yet, but that is definitely possible. We've definitely seen producers who are also retreaders, but we haven't seen anybody who's a producer and a processor. But these roles are not exclusive, and you can occupy one or more of those roles. What that means is that you have to register for each of those roles at the point that the regulation requires you to. So the producers have already registered. We're pleased to say that we've got about 95% of the expected number of producers have registered in the system, representing about 95% of tires previously reported into the OTS system. So we've got off to a really good start, and we now are into the phase where collectors, haulers, retreaders, and processors are supposed to register by the end of October 31st, and we've got about 1,700 registrations in that arena so far in the first 2 weeks, so that seems to be going quite well. Then we have the pros. So what is a pro? A pro is basically any person who's retained by a producer to do one of two things: either arrange for the establishment and operation of tire collection systems and tire management systems, or actually establish and operate those systems directly. And you'll see, based on the pros who have registered so far, that we have both of those types of pro in play already here in the marketplace. So there's two pros who basically arrange for tire collection and management and recycling of tires, and then we have a couple of pros who are actually processors as well, and so they're actually operating processing facilities. And what that means is there's lots of options in the marketplace and to choose from, and we'll get into that a little bit later on in this presentation. So one of the questions that we've seen come up in a few places where we believe there's a bit of confusion is this idea that as a producer, I have a choice between entering into a contract with a pro or entering directly into contracts with haulers and processors and other service providers. And I think it's really important for me to emphasize at this point that if you're a producer and you're entering into a contract directly with a processor for processing services, that processor becomes a pro. So you really only have one choice. So you either do it yourself directly or you engage someone else to do it for you. And when you engage someone else to do it for you, they are going to be a pro and they're going to be required to register as a pro. What does it mean to do it yourself? Well, a lot of people who have collection targets are also actually collecting tires themselves by virtue of their business. So if I'm a tire dealer and a producer, I have a collection target, but I'm also collecting tires because I'm selling tires and taking back used tires. So it's certainly open for many producers in that context to do their own collection because that's how their business works. However, unless you're actually operating your own recycling facility or your own retreading facility, you are not going to be recovering your own tires and meeting your own recycling target because you just don't have the facilities to do that, and we fully expected that to be the case. And that's why pros exist, because they're the ones that can organize the delivery of those services. Right now, I think we're aware of only one registered producer who's capable of actually doing their own collection and their own recycling or retreading of tires to meet their own targets. But beyond that, if you're not in that position, you're inevitably going to have to contract with somebody, and the person you're going to be contracting with is going to be a pro, whether they're formally announced as a pro and registered, or whether they become a pro because you just contract with them and then they have to register as a pro with us. So one way to think of pros is really they're doing what OTS is currently doing. Big difference is that OTS was kind of a monopoly provider of that or a central organizer of that, but the pros are now competing with one another to deliver that service. And the idea there is that the marketplace will deliver, competition on price points and competition on innovation, and at some point, the overall objective is that because used tires are a commodity and not a waste, that they have a value, and that an innovation will drive better use of that resource, that used tire resource, to perhaps even one day become a total profit center by itself, separate from the tire market. So I'll conclude on this slide by saying that to people who are contracting with producers to deliver any kind of processing, hauling, retreading, or collection, you will become a pro by virtue of doing that, and when that happens, you will be required to register with the authority within 30 days of entering into that kind of a contract. The next slide is basically a visual representation of how all these players work together. So if you look at the yellow arrows, they're meant to represent the regulatory relationships that exist. So you will see that producers obviously have to register with the authority and meet the reporting requirements. Pros have to register with the authority and meet the registration and reporting requirements, and so do the service providers. And then the black arrows show contractual relationships. So producers and pros and service providers have the ability to enter into contracts with one another to meet their targets. But as you will see, there are no black lines leading up to RPRA, so we're not entering into contracts with anybody. We are strictly regulating this market, and then the producers, pros, and service providers are delivering within that marketplace. I think this takes us to the first opportunity to ask questions.
Yeah, and we had a question, just a general question, asking if the slides will be made available, and yes, both a recording and a PDF of the presentation slides will be available on our website following the presentation, and we'll send participants a link to access those. We also have a question just asking, does this, and I assume this system, cover vehicle tires only or all tires?
It covers all tires. There's the people who are producers come in two categories. You either sell tires directly into the market, or you sell new cars with new tires into the market. But all of those tires are subject to the system. That part hasn't changed between what OTS is doing and what is happening under the new system. All new tires, whether they come in cars or as loose tires, are captured in this system.
The next question we have is around the frequency of reporting, and they're asking if it's true that producers report only once a year.
Yes, there's an annual reporting requirement for all registrants under the regulation, and so it applies to producers. It also applies to collectors, haulers, retreaders, and processors. But it is only once a year.
And we had a follow-up question on whether this covers just vehicles or all tires. And I think, Pat, maybe you want to speak to how people, if they have individual questions about their own situations, we might not have time to get into each person's situation today, but...
Absolutely. So, as I indicated at the very beginning, we do have a call center with registry officers who are able to answer specific questions that people have about their own specific circumstances. We will try and answer as many questions, obviously, in the course of this, but any questions that we don't answer or that are very specific to your situation, we will definitely follow up on those after this webinar so that you will get the information that you're looking for. But to just reemphasize, all tires are subject to the regulation. So if you're a producer for tires, whether they're on a vehicle that you sold or whether they're tires that you sold directly, and you meet the producer, and whether you and you're the producer for those tires, you have to report those tires and meet the collection and recycling targets related to those tires.
Okay, we have a question about the steward fee. So I'm assuming the OTS steward fee of $3.30, and they're asking if it's still in effect.
And so OTS was required to deliver a wind-up plan to the authority for approval, and one of the things that they were required to address in that wind-up plan was how they were going to wind down the operating reserves that they had built up over the years, and they were required to include a fee elimination to stewards as part of winding down that reserve. What was approved by the authority is that as of October 1st, OTS is no longer allowed to charge fees to its stewards, and because it's basically covering its costs through its reserves, which were paid by the stewards originally. So it's still in effect, the stewards paying for what OTS is doing.
We have a question from a collector, and they're saying that they're the new owner of a shop, and they don't have an Ontario Tire Stewardship number. They're asking if they need to register with both OTS and us, or is registration with us enough?
I'm assuming that you're talking about a shop that sells tires and takes back used tires. If you want to participate in the OTS system before the end of this year, then you'll have to work with OTS, and they probably will require you to register with them. You will definitely have to register with us based on the regulation by the end of October 31st, and to meet the requirements that start as of January 1st, 2019. But I think you'll have to talk to OTS about what you're doing and to determine if they need you to register for the balance of this year.
And we have a question from just asking if the new program covers rubber tracks.
No, it does not. A tire is defined to be something that's on a rim, and that it doesn't extend to rubber tracks.
The next question we have is around, again, who is the producer? Is it the vehicle manufacturer or the tire brand holder?
If the tire is on a vehicle, it'll be the vehicle manufacturer or the importer of that vehicle. As you go down that hierarchy, whoever brings that vehicle into Ontario. If it's not on a vehicle, then it'll be the same hierarchy, but it's the brand owner of for that tire, or the resident importer, or the resident marketer. The same hierarchy applies. So if it's on a vehicle, only the vehicle manufacturer.
Okay. We have several questions about pros as well, and the first one is, can producers work with different pros based on the type of tires?
Absolutely. When we were designing the registry, we recognized that the marketplace would have all sorts of different approaches to this, and so we designed it to be as flexible as we predicted the market to be. And so if you, as a producer, if you go in to identify your pros, you can see that you can do it by category of tire, large tires, passenger light truck tires, and so on, and you can have multiple pros as well. So you can have the same pro across all the categories. You can have multiple pros for different categories. You can have multiple pros for all the categories. You've got all the flexibility that you need based on marketplace requirements.
And the next question is, does RPRA have a list of pros that producers can contact?
Yes, we do. Every time people register with us, we publish the names of all of our registrants by category and on our website. And so there is a category for pros, and we have 4 registered pros on that list on our website. And you'll see their contact information on a slide at the end of this presentation as well.
Mm-hmm. So we have a question about how to contact pros, and that's a section we're going to get into later in the presentation. So we'll hold this question until we get to that point in the presentation. Likewise, we have a question about how collection targets are determined, and that's going to be in the next section of the presentation, so we'll get to that. We have a question about reporting to OTS. And the question is, do we still have to report to OTS for the remainder of the year?
If you are a steward, yes, you have to continue to report to OTS, and OTS has to continue to do what it's supposed to do until the end of the year. And of course, if you're one of the service providers under contract with OTS, you obviously have to meet those requirements with OTS for the rest of the year as well.
We just, and maybe if I know we covered this already, but is there Pat, can you maybe repeat what we mean when we say producer?
Absolutely. A producer is a person who either sells markets new vehicles with new tires on them into Ontario, or a person who markets new loose tires into the Ontario marketplace. And what determines whether or not you're the producer for those tires or for the vehicles with those tires is based on a hierarchy, which is based on residency in Ontario. So if I'm a manufacturer of tires and I'm manufacturing those tires in Ontario, or I have residency in Ontario for other business reasons, then I'm a resident manufacturer for the tires that I'm marketing in Ontario. If I'm bringing tires into Ontario, then I'm the importer and therefore I'm the importer of those tires, and they're being marketed in Ontario. I'm the producer for those tires. If there isn't a resident importer and there isn't a resident manufacturer or a resident brand holder, then if I'm the first person in Ontario marketing those vehicles in Ontario, then I'm the producer for those vehicles or those tires, as the case may be. And finally, if none of those people resident in Ontario exist, I'm outside of Ontario, and I'm marketing directly to consumers inside Ontario, then I'm producer for those tires. As I say, we are specific circumstances. We've seen all sorts of variations on that over the last several months in questions that come into our registry call center. I encourage anybody who has questions about that to call us in, and we can give you some specific help on that issue if you're wondering if you personally are a producer.
Okay. And we I have a question around, to go back to what is a pro more, and it says, if the producer is able to collect and haul the tires but cannot recycle, is it true the business must hire a pro?
So if the producer has obviously, if you're a producer, you will have the collection target and you will have the recycling target. If you can collect your own tires, that's great. You can meet your collection target directly yourself. There is no hauling target, so it doesn't matter who hauls them. So if you want to haul your own tires, that's fine. And if you're in the hauling business for used tires, you'd have to register as a hauler in any event. But if you're not actually able to recycle your own tires, then you have to hire somebody or retain the services of somebody who can provide that service to you, because that's really the only choice you have unless you want to open up your own recycling facility. I think the ministry recognized that despite individual producer responsibility requirements, that the reality of the world is that each individual producer is not going to run its own little recycling plant, and that it obviously would be much more efficient and much more economic to have people providing that service and being able to rely on that service to meet your targets and being able to utilize market forces to make that service as cost effective as possible.
We have a lot of questions. We have a couple that again are specific to someone's specific situation, and I think with this question, we'll follow up directly with you after the presentation. But we do have a question around registered collectors, and they're wanting to know that are there limits to how many tires I can collect from customers?
No, there aren't. You have the right to, as a registered collector, you will be collecting used tires primarily because you're selling new tires and taking back those. There's no limit other than perhaps some environmental, Ministry of Environment permitting requirements. At some point, when you get past a certain number of tires being stored, there are obviously some fire and safety issues that are regulated by the Ministry of Environment. That's not regulated by us, but unless you're getting into a fairly significant tire storage facility, that simply isn't going to happen in the normal course. All of the processors, for example, who operate facilities that temporarily store tires, they have environmental approvals that they have to meet to manage the environmental safety of that. But so from our perspective, no, there's no limit. You're a registered collector. You're tracking all the tires that you're collecting, and you're reporting into the registry on an annual basis on some aspects of that. And of course, all the other players are also reporting into the registry on an annual basis based on what they did the previous year. So.
And another question. They're just wanting to know what they should register as if they are a garage that sells tires.
If you are a garage that sells tires and takes back used tires, you should register as a collector. You only have to register as a collector if you're collecting used tires, and most garages who sell replacement tires are taking back the used tires, and so they would be collectors and they would register. That's the system with OTS, and that continues under the new world as well.
And we have some questions around whether the origin of tires and then the end location of tires. So a question is, if we import a unit into Ontario but it's sold to a customer in Quebec, are we still to pay for these ones?
So I think what this question is whether you have to, if you're a producer for those tires in our system, and the answer is no. You are a producer for tires that are supplied into the Ontario marketplace, so tires that are marketed in Ontario and therefore used in Ontario and become used tires in Ontario. So we know that many vehicle manufacturers and many tire distributors and so on bring tires in and back out again to meet national needs, but if the tire ends up being supplied into Ontario, it has to be reported. If it comes into Ontario but gets supplied out to some other place, then of course it doesn't get reported.
And a similar question is, can we export the old tires instead of recycle them?
From a business perspective, absolutely, but they won't count towards the recycling targets for producers. Producers have to meet their recycling targets by either the tire being sold for reuse because there's still good tread on it as a retreaded tire or as a processed tire by a processor. That's the only way you can meet your recycling targets.
And a final question for this section, and again, I think the other questions that have been asked fit nicely into the next session, so I'll hold them for now. But the final question we have here is, how does a brand holder know whether a tire we purchased is on a new vehicle or sold loose? How do we establish the producer without over-reporting?
Let's take an example. So we've got, let's say there's Goodyear and there's Honda. So Goodyear is supplying tires into Ontario, and they're reporting the tires that they supply into Ontario. Honda is supplying vehicles into Ontario, and they buy tires from all sorts of producers. Some of them they may buy from Goodyear. From a tracking point of view, the experience that we gained through the OTS system, and that's translated into the new system, is that it's very difficult for Goodyear to track the tires that end up on a Honda car. It's much easier for Goodyear to track the tires that it sells directly into the Ontario market, and it's easier for Honda to report the tires that are on the vehicles that Honda supplies into the Ontario market. So that's all we're doing here. The tires don't get double reported. If you're a Goodyear kind of producer, then the loose tires that you're as a Goodyear are supplying into the market, you're tracking those. And as a vehicle manufacturer like a Honda, the cars that you're selling into Ontario, you're tracking, and you know that there's at least 4 tires and maybe 5 if there's a spare on each one of those vehicles, so you'll be reporting 4 or 5 tires. And the brands don't matter in this context in terms of recycling targets, because those are all set in kilograms. It's not. We just need to know from a producer what's the kilogram weight of those tires that you supplied into the Ontario marketplace to set your collection target and your recycling target. And as I say, they come in loose or they come in on a car. The people who are selling the cars are tracking the ones on the cars, and the ones that are selling the loose ones are tracking the ones that are loose.
Okay, so again, several of you have asked very specific questions about your situation, and we will be following up with you after the presentation. But for now, I'll just lead us into the next section.
Okay, so the next section is going to address what a pro can do for producers. So let's start off, I think we sort of already touched on this a little bit, but if you are a producer, you're going to have a collection target and a recycling target. As a producer, you come in every year and report supply information. And for those of you who may have already registered as producers, you will know that the supply information is historical supply information based on a rolling average of 3 years of supply data with a 2-year time lag. So this, for the purposes of registering this year in 2018, you had to provide supply information for 2014, 2015, and 2016. So there's that 2-year lag between 2016 and the current year. The idea behind that was that you're reporting tires that you supplied in those years as new tires, and you're getting a collection target being set this year for 2019, and so those new tires that you supplied historically are probably starting to show up as actual used tires in 2019. So that was the rationale behind that. The second part of the rationale was to make sure that those were actually the supply numbers, because as some of the questions noted earlier on, there's a movement of tires and vehicles in and out of Ontario during a particular year, and then there's an adjustment process in the following year to get to the final supply numbers for that year. And so we wanted to make sure that supply information was final adjusted numbers, so it accounted for all the cars that came in and then got sent back out and sold in Quebec and so on, as opposed to being sold in Ontario. So this year, you're giving us those 3 years. That number is divided by 3 to get an average for the 3 years, and then it's multiplied by 85% because to set your collection target, that 85% recognizes that on average a tire is 15% lighter by the time it becomes a used tire and replaced. And so the collection target is based on that used tire weight. Next year, a producer comes in and tells us what their supply information was for 2017, and then the 2014 drops off, 2017 comes on, and we got that rolling 3-year average continuing to set your target year after year. So that's the collection target. How does the recycling target get set? The recycling target is based on recycling 85% of what you actually collect or what a pro collected on your behalf. And so you have to, these are two separate targets. You have to meet a collection target, and there's compliance consequences if you don't, and then you have to meet a recycling target based on what you actually collected, and there's separate compliance consequences if you don't make that. And then obviously you can choose to meet these targets yourself, or you can hire a pro to do it for you if you don't have the facilities to meet these targets. So, do you need a pro? If you have a collection target that has been calculated during your registration, you're also going to have a recycling target, and the vast majority of producers are very likely going to need some services in order to meet those targets. Whether they need all of the services that pros provide is based on your circumstances. If you're already a collector because you're also a producer, you're probably meeting your own collection target because you're not a producer for all of your tires. You're only a producer for some of them, and you're collecting a lot of used tires, so you'll easily meet that requirement. But beyond that, you also have this recycling target, and as I say, the vast majority of people who are producers aren't going to have their own recycling facilities. It doesn't make business sense to have that. You're in the tire business. You're not in the tire recycling business, but there are these tire recycling businesses that have the ability to provide that as a service to you to meet your requirement. So in doing that, essentially you are utilizing the services of a pro. You know, if you need processor services, you get that from a processor. You're really getting it from a pro. But the final note on all of this, of course, is regardless if you retain a pro to do this for you, you still retain the legal responsibility to meet these targets. And this is really important because when you enter into a contract with a pro, that pro is saying to you, I'm going to deliver to you enough recycling services to meet your recycling target. And but if they don't, then it means you haven't met your target and you're still responsible for that. So it becomes critical for you as a producer to look at all of the pros who are in the marketplace, look at what they're offering you, and making sure that when you enter into a contract that you're paying attention to the terms and conditions in that contract that will ensure that you're able to meet your legal responsibility under the regulation. Because they're not going to be on the hook for your target. They're on the hook for delivering to you, but you're on the hook for the target. So, producers and pros, the pro can arrange or can provide or arrange for collecting, hauling, retreading, and processing of tires. A pro can also report on behalf of a producer, and the important part of the reporting requirement is the performance. So if you hire a pro to meet your collection requirements and your recycling requirements, that pro can directly report that into your account. But the only way that the pro is going to have access to your account is if you have come in and into the registry and said, this is my pro and I consent to them having access. So we know that at the end of the registration period for producers, only about less than 40 producers had actually indicated that they had contracted with a pro, and so that means there's about 500 producers out there that haven't, and we know that the market is adapting and people are talking and working out what they're going to do and all of that, and that's great. But once you've actually landed on a contract with a pro to meet your targets, you have to remember to come back into the registry and say, I just hired pro number 1 or pro number 2, and this is what they're doing for me and for which category of tires they're doing it for me. And you have to indicate whether they're going to be reporting for you, and if you indicate that they are, then you have to say, and I consent to them having access to my account for that purpose. The only information that a pro will see in your account is the information that they put in. They will not see any other information. So if you have multiple pros, for example, and you don't want one pro to see what another pro is doing, rest assured that they can't. They can only see what they put into your account on your behalf, and that's it. So as I indicated, we got 4 pros in the marketplace now, 4 registered. Based on the conversations we've had over the last few weeks, we expect that at least 2 more are going to be coming and registering with us. So lots of options in there. And as I say, when you look at your options and pick somebody to contract with, just keep in mind, ultimately you're still responsible for your own targets, and so make sure you've got contracts that are going to work for you. The pros are service providers. They're meeting your needs, and your need includes meeting the compliance requirements under the regulation.
Okay, and we have several questions, and again, now's your opportunity to type them in, and we'll try to get to as many as we can. I wanted to pick up on a thread that we talked about in the last question period, just some more clarification from Pat. It says, the Goodyear-Honda analogy does not address when OEMs sell tires loose and on new vehicles. Many trailer manufacturers sell trailers and parts, i.e. new tires, as replacements.
Well, that's fair enough. I mean, there are multiple scenarios, obviously. So, and you're right. So one scenario is the Goodyear-Honda kind of analogy. So the next level of analogy is I'm a Honda dealer, and so I know that Honda is reporting all the tires that came in on the new Honda cars that I'm selling as a dealer. But as a dealer, people who bought the Honda car from me are going to come back in and say, I need new tires, and I'm going to give them new tires and collect used tires. So if those used tires, if those new tires are tires that came from Goodyear, for example, well, you'll probably know that because there might be a tire handling fee associated with that, so that it means that probably somebody else reported them. You're not going to be the producer for those tires unless those replacement tires, unless you're the one that imported them into Ontario. So either you're the brand owner, or you're the importer of those tires, or the first person to market them in Ontario. And there are car dealers and tire dealers who are in that position, and so yes, you will be a producer maybe for some of the tires that you're selling as replacement tires. You're not a producer for the cars that you're selling because that's already caught by Honda, and Honda's already registered and reported those tires. It really depends on where those tires, how those tires got into Ontario, and as the person selling those tires, presumably you will know how you got those tires. Did you arrange for them to be brought into Ontario? Then that makes you the importer and the producer for those tires.
And I'm not quite sure, they're not directly related to our presentation, but since we have Pat here, we do have a couple questions around the upcoming OTS fee elimination period, and how that impacts the tires they sell to consumers. So I'm not sure how much Pat can get into that in this presentation, but we'll ask the questions anyways, because we know that there are questions that several of you have. And it says, since OTS will be waiving the fee starting October 1st, do we have to waive this fee when selling a tire?
So OTS charges its stewards fees, and it won't be allowed to do that anymore starting October 1st. However, we recognize that many dealers will have tires in their inventory that what happens is the steward pays the fee to OTS, and then the steward passes that fee down the distribution chain, and then ultimately it's added to a customer's bill as a tire handling fee. So we know that dealers are going to have post-October 1st, they may well have some tires for which a fee has been passed down to them on. And of course, like any business, you're always entitled to recover the costs that you incur because you're not going to operate your business at a loss. You want to cover your costs and make a bit of profit. So if you've paid, if the fee has been passed down to you in your inventory and you've paid that fee, you're perfectly entitled to recover that cost. We don't regulate that. That's not, and we have no position on that. And in January 1, things are going to be different. You're still probably, if you're a producer or you're selling tires that were given to you by a producer, there's probably going to be some costs that are going to be flowed through to you again. The issue after January 1st is whether you're going to have that as a visible line item on your bill, and there's some specific requirements that you have to meet if you do. But again, the basic principle is you get to cover your costs and make some money in your business. You're not going to give away your tires at a loss. But there will be some special rules after starting January 1st about making that fee visible or including it if you want to avoid those rules, you just include that cost in the cost of your tire.
And we covered how collection targets are calculated. This question is from our previous session, but I just wanted to ask it again just to clarify. Are producers expected to calculate their collection targets once the OTS data is outdated?
So all the producers have to report to us on an annual basis are the tires that they supplied into the market. Right now, for 2014, 15, 16, 17, and probably 18, that information was previously reported to OTS, so it didn't make sense for people to have to reinvent the wheel, so the option of using that previously submitted information was made available for the purposes of the registry. Obviously, there won't be any supply information for 2019 in the OTS system because OTS will have been wound down by then. But when you hit 2021, you're still going to have to tell us how many tires you supplied in 2019, and just like you did in the previous years, and number of tires and the weight of those tires will be used to set your collection target. So this is information that as a producer you track anyway. You know the number of tires that you're responsible for, and you have to continue to report those just like you always did.
Okay. Now we're getting into some questions around what pros can do on behalf of producers. And the question is, can a pro pay the annual registration fee on a producer's behalf?
No. So on an annual basis, producers have to come in and report their supply data, and that supply data then is used to calculate the fee that's charged to a producer to cover the cost of operating the registry and related costs at the authority. So the producer has to come in every year because that's their information. They know their own supply information. They give it to us on an annual basis, and then they pay the fee at that time. They have to come in anyway, and the fee gets paid at the time they come in. The annual reporting date is May 31st is the deadline of every year, and pros are only allowed to report on the performance that they delivered to producers. So if a pro said, I collected 4,000 kilograms of tires to meet the 4,000 kilogram target of this producer, that's what they're going to report, and I arranged for recycling that meets the 85% of that 4,000 for the recycling target, and I can report that in. That's what they can report.
The next question is, can a pro assist producers for different annual audits that are part of their obligations?
So the supply information is subject to an audit requirement, with the exception, of course, in the early years. If you are just using the previously submitted data to OTS, then as those of you who've gone through the process will know, there's no audit requirement for that because it's already gone through a process of verification at OTS. When we get into the newer years post-OTS, the 2019 supply years and onwards, there's an audit requirement. So a producer will come in and say, I have supplied in the year 2019 X number of tires and at this weight, and here's my audit report that verifies that, in fact, that's true. So that's a producer responsibility. The pros are arranging for performance. The performance requirements are also subject to an audit requirement, and to verify that the targets, in fact, were reached. But it's still an independent audit requirement. The pro is not going to audit itself, so the independent audit requirements continues. We are in the process of working right now on defining more specifically what the annual reporting requirements are going to look like, and as part of that, we want to also consult and develop an audit standard so that everybody knows exactly what has to be done. So over the next few months, you're going to start seeing some announcements on that and a consultation process to develop an audit standard. And then once that audit standard has been developed and approved, then everybody will know what needs to be done and who can do it. So a great question, and we're working to bring more clarity to that issue.
Mm-hmm. We have a question that is, what is RPRA doing to ensure that all Ontario producers are registered?
So we started with the list of stewards at OTS, and based on the definition of producer in the regulation and based on the people that were registered with the OTS system, we were forecasting that approximately 540 producers were, we were able to identify about 540 entities that would be required to register as producers, and we've tracked against that list. During the course of the registration period, we did a phone campaign to talk directly to each and every one of them, and so that they would understand that there's a new requirement if they hadn't heard of it, and then we could answer any questions that they might have as a result of the new rules. And as I say, it looks like at this point we have about 95% of that list has been registered, and the follow-up to that, of course, will be to look at the people we thought were going to come in and who didn't, and we'll go and talk to them to find out why they didn't, and if they should have, we'll explain that they need to, and then we have a progressive compliance process that allows us to take steps to make sure that everybody who's supposed to comply, in fact, does comply. So we can issue compliance orders and administer penalties. In extreme cases, we can prosecute people. But we have a number of compliance tools available to us to get people registered. It's in our interest to make sure that everybody gets registered. It's in every producer's interest because nobody wants any free riders in the system, and we recognize that. So we have a process for making sure that, to the extent that's reasonably possible, that everybody who's supposed to register gets identified and ultimately registered.
Okay, so we have a number of questions coming in around the OTS fee elimination, and I think what we'll do is we'll hold them until the end of our presentation. So we want to make sure we get all the pro-related questions covered in this presentation, and as well, a lot of the questions coming in have to do with collectors and other service providers, and that's the section we're going to cover off next. So we'll get to those questions in a few minutes.
Okay, so how can a pro work with collectors, haulers, processors, and retreaders? Starting point is, if you are collecting tires or hauling tires or retreading tires or processing tires, you have to register with the authority and provide the required registration information, including your collection sites that you operate by October 31st, 2018. And we're going to use the collection site data, for example, to compare that to what is required under the regulation to meet all the accessibility requirements across the province under the regulation. And the process for doing that will start on November 1st, obviously, because we need to know what all the collection sites are before we can do that. But key thing is, if you are collecting used tires or hauling them or retreading them or processing them, you are required to register with the authority. So, and the reason for that is that producers are only able to meet the collection and recycling targets with tires that actually were collected and hauled and retreaded and processed by registered parties in the registry. There are some exceptions. If you're a municipality that has been collecting tires, at a municipal waste disposal site, for example, you are exempt from the registration requirement. If you're a Crown operator of waste disposal sites that have been collecting tires, you're also exempt from the requirement to register. Those tires can be required. In fact, the Crown operators are entitled to call on producers to come and pick up their tires. And we are working on some additional compliance guidance with respect to municipal sites and Crown sites so that there's a bit more clarity about how those tires get tracked within the system, given that they likely won't have a registration number. We will be asking municipalities to consider the possibility of a voluntary registration simply for the purposes of getting that number to make it easier to track, but that's a decision that municipalities are free to make. There's no requirement for them to register, and if they do, they won't be engaged in the compliance requirements because this is really a voluntary thing that they're not required to do. But we will be issuing some compliance guidance on that at some point next month. I think we're targeting, and just to help people understand a bit better how that piece of it works. The fact that you've registered with the fact that you have entered into a contract with a pro to meet collection targets doesn't mean that you're off the hook for registering as a collector if you're actually collecting tires, because that's a separate responsibility. One of the reasons why, as a tire collector, you might actually be entering into a contract with a pro is because you're collecting more tires than you need to meet your own collection target, and so used tires are a commodity, and they may have value. At a minimum, you should be able to get those tires picked up for free because the collection targets are very aggressive, and they're aimed at almost 100% of the tire supply. People are going to need those tires to meet their recycling targets, and so it's important that as a collector you're registered, because those tires have to be in the system attached to a registration number in order to count. I think that's on that slide. If you're a producer and you retain a pro to do things for you, obviously the pro can then go and enter into commercial arrangements with other entities, including collectors and haulers and retreaders and processors. So if a pro is entering into an agreement with any of those entities, those entities don't have a separate requirement to enter into to register as a pro, because there's a pro already there. The only time a processor will have to also register as a pro is when a processor enters directly into a contract with a producer. The producer is entered into a contract with a pro, and then the pro enters into a contract with a processor, then the processor only has to register as a processor and not as a pro as well. Again, I think this was pointed out a couple of times, and a question came up, I think, at least once. A pro cannot report on behalf of service providers, just like they can't do things on behalf of producers in terms of registering and reporting supply and paying registration fees on behalf of producers. Service providers don't have to pay fees at this point, but they have to do their own reporting. Pros have to do their separate reporting, and producers have to do their separate reporting.
Okay, yeah, we have several questions coming in, and the first one is just a clarification around the reporting requirement, the May 31st, 2020 deadline.
Yeah.
It says the reports being made for May 31st, 2020, will they be for the calendar year of January 1st to December 31st, 2019?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So there are two performance requirements. There's the collection target performance requirements. You have to meet a collection target, and then there's the recycling target, which you have to meet. The collection target is based on a calendar year, and the recycling target is based on a March to March. And the reason that it was done that way, staggered that way, was it was recognized that for the first 3 months of a calendar year, you might be collecting tires, but they might not be getting into the recycling system for a couple of months because they have to be collected and then brought to a processor who then has to process them. So in designing the timing of the targets, that a 3-month lag period was built into that system. So the performance period for collection is calendar year. The performance period for recycling is March to March, and then 3 months after that, the March period is the May 31st reporting requirement. So the reporting requirement captures those two periods as one reporting requirement.
And then we do have a couple questions just around clarifying what qualifies as collector and when someone would have to register as a collector. So this question is, I am a collector that won't be reselling tires for reuse since I am a transfer station disposal site. The tires that happen to be in our garage pile are pulled out and shipped out. They were pulled out and shipped out with OTS previously. under OTS I'm a collector, but with RPRA, does my role stand?
So, a tire collector, person who owns or operates a tire collection site in Ontario, and a tire collection site is basically any place that used tires are collected. So in the context of the definitions in the regulation, you would continue to be a collector, and so you would obviously have to register as a collector. And you had a relationship with OTS, and as we indicated at the beginning, the role of OTS is being replaced by pros, and so now you're looking at having a relationship with one or more pros so that those tires can continue to be collected from your site.
And the next question is, if we get into a contract with a pro, do we still need to register as a collector if they are picking up our used tires?
Yes, you're still operating a tire collection site. That makes you a tire collector, and the regulation says you have to register. But the way to look at it, I think, is you probably want those tires picked up. You're probably participating in the system, and one of the advantages, of course, of registering is you now have a authority registration number, which means that those are that identifies those tires that can be used to meet other producers' collection targets and recycling targets. So that's the reason why you have to continue to register. It's absolutely true that pros might be picking those tires up, but that's because they've sent a hauler in to do it, and the hauler who's picking them up is also registered, and that hauler will be bringing them to a retreader or a processor, and that retreader and processor is also registered. So every point in the service provider chain is registered, including the collectors. And the pro is separately registered as a pro and saying, this is what I'm doing.
The next question is, this person, they sell new trailers and they've registered as a producer, but they also service their own fleet and outside customer trailers, meaning keeping the used worn tires. Do we need to register as a collector as well?
All right, so if I understand the question correctly, you operate a fleet of trailers that you continue to own, and you service that fleet of trailers, and of course from time to time you have to replace worn out tires with new tires, and you accumulate those tires. But then you're also saying that you also service trailers that you've sold to customers and replace those tires. So if you were only doing your own fleet, again, you would be exempt from the requirement to register as a collector. So fleet operators have to develop arrangements to deal with their tires to bring them to a collector. But the moment you start collecting used tires from other people, then that makes you a collector, and so you would register. Again, you're not a producer for those. You don't have collection targets and you don't have recycling targets. You're just a collector, and you have a registration number, and you're meeting whatever the reporting requirements are and entering into whatever arrangements you need to enter into with other service providers and pros and so on. So, for example, one model that we've seen is a pro will contract with a processor and say to the processor, we're only going to deal with you. You have to deal with haulers and collectors, and then the processor will enter into agreements with haulers and collectors to collect tires. So we expect all of that activity to continue. Meanwhile, the pro is dealing with the processor and then delivering a performance on collection and recycling to producer clients of the pro.
Okay. Then we have some general questions about this question about how do I know my targets, my collection targets as a collector?
I think, as I just mentioned, as a collector, you don't have collection targets. The collection target is a producer target. So anybody who's supplying tires into the Ontario market is responsible for those tires, and they have a collection target in relation to the tires that they supplied. You're just a service provider if you're a collector. If you happen to be a producer as well as a collector, which I indicated earlier is quite possible when you're a tire dealer, because you're collecting used tires from your customers, but you might be importing some of those new tires to give to your customers, so therefore you might be a producer for some of the tires. Then yes, in that context, you might well have a collection target, but not because you're a collector, but because you're a producer. So important to keep that distinction in mind. But if all you're doing is collecting and you're not a producer for any of the tires you're selling, then you don't have a collection target. Someone else does, for sure. So your tires are going to be valuable to somebody, and somebody's going to want to come and get those tires because they have targets that they have to meet.
And do collectors pay a fee?
No, they don't.
Okay. And we had a similar question just asking, are the fees listed on our website? And yes, they are. If you go to rpra/registry, you should see the resources on the right-hand side of the screen. And we have a lot of questions coming in, so I just wanted to scroll through to try to get to all of the collector or service provider obligation questions. We have a question about the pro's ability. It says, and this may be related more to producers, but it's, will pros be able to provide you with your recycling data once the new program is in effect, or will they provide data to the collector when a pickup is done?
In terms of what we need to know, a pro has the ability to report to us what it did on behalf of its producers. So a pro can report that it collected X kilograms of tires for producer number 1 and X for producer number 2 and producer number 3, whoever their producer clients are. And they can also report to us the number of kilograms of tires that were recycled on behalf of producer number 1 and 2 and 3 and the rest of their producer clients. They may have separate information requirements under the contracts that they have with collectors and haulers, but that's a market business-to-business issue. It has nothing to do with us. So what the producers have to do is meet their targets, and they can hire a pro to help them meet those targets, and the pro can report the performance in meeting those targets into the producer's account.
So we have, do collectors have to report to us?
Yes, there's an annual reporting requirement. That the first time that will kick in for a collector will be in 2020, because 2019 is the first reporting year. And as I indicated earlier, we have been working with respect to what those reporting requirements need to look like. Our objective has been to make the requirement as minimal as possible in order to meet our compliance objectives, so that people aren't reporting stuff just for the sake of reporting. And we are going to be communicating on that quite shortly, what those annual reporting requirements look like. For collectors, they're pretty straightforward. One of the things that happens at the collector level is, for example, tires can get sorted out for reuse because they still have good tread on them, and those have value to collectors who want to do that. So a collector who separates out tires and sells them for reuse has to report those tires to us. And the reason you have to report those tires to us is because those are tires that count against the recycling target. Recycling includes reuse, part of the 3 R's, and reduce, reuse, recycle. And so to the extent that tires are reused, then they count against an annual recycling requirement that's of value to a producer. There are a few other things that collectors will also be reporting, but we're trying to make it as straightforward and as easy as possible. And as I say, in the next couple of months, we're going to be issuing some further compliance guidance on that, along with the audit standard that will apply to producers. There won't be an audit requirement for collectors. We're not requiring that at all, and it's just going to be a straight reporting requirement, and it's going to be quite minimal.
We have a couple questions around how people can get their tires picked up. This question is, if a collector, and this is from a municipality, if a collector is not required to provide a fee, do we simply contact a hauler to pick up the tires at the municipal transfer station? Right.
So this is a municipal site we're talking about. I'm not sure if I understand the reference to a fee. So a municipal operator of a collection site does not have to register as a collector. Every time this question has raised, the point that I always want to make sure I emphasize is that there is no requirement for municipalities to actually collect tires. We recognize that a lot of municipalities end up being collectors of tires by virtue of operating transfer stations or waste disposal sites where tires show up, and so you have the option of taking those tires to a registered collector, or getting into an arrangement with haulers or with a pro to say, I've got tires, will you come and collect them? You have all of those arrangements available to you in the new world, to the extent that they were available in the old world. They're still available in the new world.
And we have another question. This is from as a collector, can we expect pros or producers to approach us to set up agreements to pick up?
So we're looking at a marketplace, and we have a lot of market participants, and those participants all have their own interests. If I'm a collector, my interest is being able to sell new tires to my customers and take back their used tires, and making sure that someone will take those used tires away. So if I want to protect my interest, I would go and seek out people who will agree to take those tires away, knowing that those tires have value to somebody to meet collection targets. As I say, at a minimum, somebody should be prepared to pick those tires up at no cost to you. And who knows, when tires become more and more valuable, used tires become more and more valuable, people might want to buy those tires from you. But it is a marketplace, and so I think I wouldn't necessarily assume that a pro is going to reach out to each and every collector to say, so, do you want to enter into a deal for your tires? Because at last count, there was about 6,000 of collectors out there, and there's only 4 pros. So, I think everybody has to kind of work together here to reach out to one another and get organized. We also know that a lot of collectors have arrangements already with haulers and processors. So it may be that that's what happens, is those arrangements continue into the new world, and so you don't have to reach out to a pro because you've already got an arrangement with a hauler, or you've already got an arrangement with a processor, all of whom have their own interest in being able to get tires and make money dealing with used tires and processing new tires. So it's the marketplace is there, and based on your own specific circumstances, maybe you have to chase a pro. Maybe a pro will be chasing you. Maybe you already have an arrangement with a processor. Maybe a processor is going to chase you. It all depends on your circumstances and where you are. But ultimately, it's important to make sure that at some point, as soon as possible, you've got something in place that will continue the pickup of your used tires from your collection site.
And we have a number of questions around how do producers know that they're meeting their targets? I know this is a little bit not sure where else we can put this now, so we'll answer all of them here. We have a simple question, well, not simple, but a straightforward question for you, Pat. Is there a penalty for not meeting your targets?
There are potentially penalties that will apply. The circumstances in which those penalties will apply will be based on the circumstances leading up to the non-compliance. But yes, as a regulator, we have a number of compliance tools that can address any situation of non-compliance, including the failure to meet a collection target and the failure to meet a recycling target. And the penalty, there are maximum penalties provided for in the statute. They're not in the regulation; they're in the statute. And administrative penalties are also possible, which are also provided for in the statute. So, yeah. Our primary goal for this transition year is to achieve as much compliance on a voluntary basis, on an educational basis, as possible. And and once that transition has happened and settles down, then we'll be looking at other tools down the road when other problems arise that shouldn't happen. We know there's going to be some issues just because of the transition, and we're going to work to get past those problems as much as we can. And we're not going to come out like a cop at first instance to beat you up because at the very first instance perhaps for something that was beyond your control you couldn't make it. But it's all going to relate to the circumstances in which the non-compliance happens.
Okay. And we have a couple of similar questions. It's along the lines of, as a producer, if we're not the ones who are collecting old tires at all, how do we know that our targets are being met? And it says, this specific question says, how do I know our customers have sent their tires to collection places?
Okay, so let me start with the back end. You don't need to know where your customers bring their used tires. You don't have, as a producer, there's no requirement to track your specific tires. Your collection target is based on kilograms, and you just have to make sure that the collection target in kilograms is met. How will you know whether it's met? It's either because you actually are collecting tires, and so you'll know that whether you've collected enough tires to meet your target because you're in the business of collecting those used tires directly from your customers. If you've contracted with a pro, then I'm going to assume that you're going to have some requirement in that contract that has your pro reporting to you, and so that you can track that, because that's a contractual relationship that you have with someone else who's collecting tires on your behalf. So, as I said, make sure that when you enter into these contracts that you're making sure that there's terms and conditions in there to achieve the purpose of entering into that contract, which is to meet that collection target. I think it's fair game to require a pro to report to you on a regular basis as to how they're doing, and probably to report to you if they think they're not going to make it, so that you can make other arrangements, because there's no requirement for you to be exclusive with any pro. You can hire as many pros as you want, and subject to the contractual relationships, get out of those contracts with people if your needs aren't being met, and so on. So pay attention to the contract, get legal advice on that contract, make sure that, if you do get legal advice, that your counsel knows that the purpose of this is to meet regulatory requirements. I have to meet a collection target of X, and 85% of it is my recycling target, and does this contract do it for me? Right? So these are the things you have to do. This is just straight due diligence.
Okay, so Pat, you're going to have to help me with this next one, because I'm not familiar with sections 12 and 13 of the regulation by heart, but the question is, sections 12 and 13 of the regulation, I assume the tires regulation, stipulates that every retailer who supplies tires shall publish and clearly display on their website. Can this be done via the pro's website?
Section. I'm just pulling up the sections here because to go by memory. So every producer shall implement a promotion and education program, publishing and clearly displaying the following information on their website: the location of the producer's tire collection sites for each tire type, where the consumers may return tires at no charge. So we've looked at that requirement, and certainly one of the things that's happening during registration is that collectors are registering, and one of the things that they're including in their registration is the address and location of their tire collection sites, and we're going to publish all of those on our website. So that information will certainly be available on our website. I think that for the producers who have websites and who are required, they can simply take that information and put that on their website if they want, or put a link on their website to our website. But so there's lots of different ways to meet this requirement. Putting it on a pro's website would be an additional advantage, but that doesn't meet the producer's requirement, because this one's directed at producers to display things on their websites, not on someone else's website. But this is one of the things that we're going to address, as I said, in some of the compliance guidance that's going to be coming out over the next several months, and we want to make sure that this is implemented as rationally as possible. One of the issues specifically is in relation to collection sites. We will be issuing a collection bulletin that has a lot of things that hopefully people will find helpful, and how to meet all the requirements around collection sites. And I think where we're headed on that one, without having it in its final form yet, is how are people going to indicate where the collection sites are. And one of the options we're actively looking at is a link to our list of collection sites. But we're going to finalize that over the next little while, because again, this is about accessibility. This is about a member of the public being able to find easily, a collection site if they need one for their tires, because they have tires that they need to drop off. So we're going to be providing some guidance on that before the end of this year.
Okay, and so we have a lot of questions coming in on how do I find a pro, what kind of contracts do I need, and that's our next section. So I just wanted to round off this question section with one from a hauler, and we did cover this, but maybe, Pat, you can restate it. And the question is the hauler incentive remaining the same?
So I guess the top answer is I have no idea. The hauler incentive that's currently being paid is organized by OTS and set by OTS. Obviously, if you're a hauler, you're providing a service and you want to get paid for that service. So, and hauling will still be required after January 1st of 2019. And so I'm assuming that haulers are not going to work for free and that somebody's going to pay them. So that's a matter of contract between the haulers and the people who want them to haul tires. And so that's the pros or the processors or whoever it is that is engaging those services. I'm assuming they're going to pay. What rate that is going to be offered is a market issue and a business-to-business issue, and that people will deal with in the marketplace.
Okay, so moving on to the next section.
How do I find a pro? So, when we were setting up the system, we recognized that pros didn't actually have to register until after they had started entering into contracts. But we knew that a number of organizations were planning to become pros, and once we knew who they were, we had a conversation with each and every one of them to say, I know you don't have to register until 30 days after you start entering into contracts, but we're pretty sure that you're not going to be entering into contracts for a while. In the meantime, people are going to want to know who you are, and we're setting up a registry system that will identify pros, but the only way that it can identify pros is if you're already registered. So we encouraged everybody who is going to be a pro to register as soon as they could. We have 4 currently registered. We have had conversations with a couple of other entities that we believe will probably register soon. But the best way to find a pro, I guess, right now is look at our website to see who's registered. Otherwise, if they're not registered, they're going to have to find you, and they're out because they're out there marketing. But we have the 4 pros registered at the moment, and their contact information is on the website. So you just come to our website, rpra.ca, and look for our list of registered entities, which includes the pros. For those of you who are wondering what it means to register as a pro, when we opened up the registry for producers and then subsequently for service providers, we started seeing something that wasn't supposed to happen, which was people registering by mistake as a pro. So we removed the Register Now button from the website so that that wouldn't happen anymore. We know that it's a very small group of people, right now 4, maybe 5 or 6 going forward. So in order to avoid the problem that we saw, we're just asking anybody who's getting into the pro business to contact us. That allows us to go through a process to answer questions and provide information, and then get you registered. So if you're a service provider that wants to contract directly with producers to provide hauling or processing or collecting, that turns you into a pro, and you want to know what that means, just give us a call and we'll make it work for you. The last point I think we want to cover is timing. When do you need to have a pro? So there's no formal regulatory deadline for finding a pro. The practical reality is that the vast majority of people who fall within the definition of producer are going to need the services of somebody to meet the recycling targets. And the sooner you get organized on that, probably the better, because the performance year begins January 1st, 2019, and and ends on December 31st for collection, and starts March for recycling, and ends March 2020 for the recycling target, so that you have to be able to report by May 31st that you met those two targets. So the sooner you get organized, the better. We're expecting that there's probably going to be some market forces at work, so if you wait too long, you might end up paying more because you took a long time to register. It really comes down to your collection target. That's the starting point. So a pro is going to need to know, what your collection target is, and then you're going to need to know how much it's going to cost for them to meet that target for you, and then meet the related recycling target that goes with that. So right now, I think there's a lot of options available in the marketplace. A lot of pros are obviously competing with one another on price point. We're not sure yet exactly how that's shaking down. We see a little bit of that, but not all of it, because we're not involved in the marketplace. But every pro is, as far as I can tell, more than willing to talk to any producer and to see if they can meet your needs. Some of them are focused on different segments of the market, but there's going to be somebody out there that will be willing to provide a service to you.
Okay. And the topic of there only being 4 registered pros has come up in some of our questions. And it says, there's only 4 registered pros at this point. Certain pros are restricted to certain manufacturers only. The question is, there's not much information out there, and they said no competition providing cost certainty for producers.
Well, I mean, there is competition because there are 4 pros there, and they are competing with one another. As I say, maybe 1 or 2 of them is focusing on one part of the market, but still a competitive market. No different from any other service that's out there. You're going to go to pro number 1 and say, my collection target is 5,000 kilograms of tires. How much will it cost how much will you charge me to meet that? And you're going to have that conversation with all 4 pros and see what they're prepared to charge you for that. Beyond that, I'm not sure what more I can say. There are 4 pros. We're looking at maybe another 1 or 2 coming in. It's early days yet, and this is only year 1, and we'll see what happens through the course of the first year and what impact that has on the second year. But it is a transition year, and we recognize that there's some uncertainty as a result of that, and nobody likes uncertainty. We understand that. We experience our own version of uncertainty as well, and so we certainly respect the fact that people are being asked to do something a bit differently from the way they used to do it, and start looking at a marketplace that looks a bit different from what it used to look like. And we want to be able to help with that transmission as much as possible. And as I say, specific questions on any specific issues, please call us. We're
The next question is, does RPRA have template contracts that we can use, i.e. a contract between a producer and a pro?
No, we're not in the business of managing the marketplace. The market participants have to come up with the contracts. When a pro comes to a producer, the pro is going to offer a contract to the producer, and the producer is going to have to read that contract really carefully and negotiate that contract so that the contract meets the producer's requirements, and then the pro understands what the pro is supposed to deliver, and everybody understands what the price is for delivering that service. So it wouldn't be appropriate for us to provide templates for that, and because this is a business-to-business contractual relationship.
Next question. If we are a producer and we do not collect any used tires, as it's not part of our business, we understand that we have to hire a pro to meet our collection target. How can we ensure that they do this?
So conceptually, a pro will enter into a contract with you to say, I will collect enough tires somewhere in Ontario to meet your requirement. The pro doesn't have to collect any specific tires or any particular brand of tires. A pro just has to make sure that it engages in enough engages enough service providers to collect enough tires to meet the collection targets of all the producers that it's working for. And as an individual producer, I would want to make sure that I understand how that works for me. So if a pro is telling me I'm going to collect enough tires to meet your requirement, I want to know how they're going to do that and how they're going to report that to me, and what happens if they can't make it, and whatever else is relevant to entering into that contract. And then I'd probably get legal advice to make sure that that's all working for me. And because the pro will be getting legal advice too on how to structure the contract. Everybody has to look at that contract as a legal relationship.
And they have a follow-up to that. There doesn't seem to be any local pros. How do we handle that?
Again, conceptually, it probably doesn't matter whether there's a local pro or not. All that matters is that there's a pro who's going to collect tires, and in collecting tires is entering into a contract with you to say that we're collecting tires on your behalf and we're going to meet your requirements and on a contractual basis. So the pro is going to be all over the province, collecting tires from all over the province for all of its clients to meet the total collection target for all of those clients.
The next question, this person said they've contacted the 4 pros listed on our website and left messages with no reply. How do I find a pro not listed?
If somebody's not registered with us, we can't really point you. As I said, we've had a couple of conversations with folks who are planning to do that, but obviously those are confidential. They have to make their own announcements into the marketplace and then get registered with us. But the moment they're registered with us, then it becomes public. All I can say is stay tuned, and if you're not getting answers back from the pro, and try again, because it may be that they're just having trouble keeping up with the volume of calls. As I say, there's 4 pros, and there's more than 500 producers in the system, and so that's a lot of people to talk to, and so keep going, keep doing it.
We have a number of questions related to fees and costs for producers. This one is, if I am understanding correctly, a producer who is contracted with a pro will have the following costs: an annual fee based on collection target and subsequent fees involved with the audit process. And as long as the pro meets the recycling target based on the producer's collection target, there will be no additional costs other than the contracted price arranged between the producer and the pro. Is this correct?
Well, we're not really in a position to comment on that, because what you're talking about are all the things that are managed within the contract that you have with the pro. So whatever the contract is, that's what governs. So if a pro enters into a contract with you to say, this is the price I'm going to charge you, then that's the price they're going to charge you. If there's other costs that the pro wants to charge you, they're going to have to obviously negotiate that with you in the contract. And at the end of the day, the contract is the contract. So we're not involved in that, and obviously we don't know what those contracts look like. But whatever's in the contract is in the contract. That's why, again, my main message on this one is to say, pay attention to the terms and conditions of that contract in relation to what you have to do, which is meet a collection target and a recycling target, and make sure that you enter into a contract that's designed to do that.
And next question is, do the costs that producers incur by contracting with a pro and the costs that they incur by their registry fees to us, can they recoup those from their customers?
Of course. Every cost that somebody incurs is a cost that you recover, and we talked a little bit about the cost of meeting those targets, and the only thing that we are going to look at is if you isolate that cost as a separate line item to a consumer, then there's some rules that you have to pay attention to. You have to tell the consumer who's responsible for charging that cost. Is it Michelin or Goodyear or Honda or whomever? and you have to tell them what it's being used for. That way a consumer knows that this isn't some weird tax or some made-up cost or whatever. And again, if you make that a visible fee on your invoice to the consumer, then you will also have to do an audit report when you report in on that to verify that, in fact, that was the cost, that, in fact, it was a real number and that was actually used for recycling purposes. So, but that only comes into play if you choose to make that particular cost of a tire visible to the consumer. There's all sorts of costs that go into a tire, the cost of rubber, the cost of steel, the fluff, the fiber, the logistics, the transportation, the overhead of the dealership, and all of these are costs. And the philosophy here is that included in the cost is the management of that resource when it reaches the end of life, because it is a resource, it's not a waste. So if that's the total cost of the tire, then you have the option of saying that's the price for the tire, includes all those costs and a reasonable profit margin, or you can isolate any of those costs, including that one. But if you isolate that one, then you've got some additional regulatory requirements to meet. And it's totally a business decision whether you do that or not.
And jumping back to our last section, the producer asking, when we enter into a contract with a pro, do they arrange the tire pickup, or do we also need a hauler?
Well, again, that totally comes down to the terms of the contract. So if you enter into a contract with a pro that is intended to meet all of your collection and recycling requirements, then I guess that's the pro's responsibility to figure out how to pick up those tires, so they'll have arrangements with haulers and so on. You can separately contract with a hauler if you want. It's really down to what makes the most sense from a business perspective. Again, if I was a small producer, I don't want to get into multiple contractual relationships. I'm going to be looking for somebody who can say, I have to meet this collection target and this recycling target, make it happen, Sulu, and then get on with it, and how much are you going to charge me for it? So our expectation is that pros are going to take care of all of those services based on what we've heard in terms of the pitches they make in the public forums that we've seen them talking in. They're certainly contemplating managing all of those services to meet the producer requirements.
And can multiple haulers pick up tires from the same collector?
Whatever makes business sense and whatever business arrangements you enter into, that's what drives all of this. So if you want to engage multiple haulers, if you're a collector, or engage with a processor who's got multiple haulers, it doesn't matter. All that matters is that tires get collected and recycled, and that producers meet the targets associated with that.
Okay, and we have those fee elimination questions waiting there, and we'll get to them after we're done our presentation. So maybe I'll just give everyone on the line a few minutes to just ask any last questions they have related to how to find a pro, or do I need a pro, anything like that. Okay, not seeing anything coming in. We'll just kind of wrap up our pro section of the webinar. And again, if you have any more related questions, our registry support team is available at registry@rpra.ca, or you can call us 647-496-0530, or toll free 833-600-0530. As well, as I mentioned, a recording of this webinar will be posted on our website along with the presentation slides. If you go home tonight and a question pops into your head, you can always email us at registry@rpra.ca, or you can also tune in tomorrow for a repeat, basically, of today's session, all the same content, but it will be tomorrow, Thursday, September 19th at 2 p.m., and registration for that is on our website as well. I am seeing questions come in, so that's great, and we do have some time. We have about 20 more minutes to get to them, so we'll jump into it again. Again, we have the Goodyear issue coming up. And the question is, I see there's a number here, so this person must have written other ones. Nope. Okay. It's how will Goodyear know whether the tires went on new vehicles or were sold loose? For example, if I buy 100 tires from Goodyear, I put 60 on new trailers I've manufactured, and I'm the producer. I sell 40 loose tires for tire replacement, and then Goodyear would be the producer for those. Would Goodyear assume, as an OEM, that I'll report all the tires?
So this is a question that comes up in the context of vehicle manufacturers versus tire manufacturers and how those two groups keep things clear between themselves. For the most part, the way it has worked so far is that vehicle manufacturers and the tire manufacturers keep track of what they're doing with one another, so that the tire manufacturer reports all the loose tires, knowing that the tires that ended up in the vehicle manufacturer's hands are being reported by the vehicle manufacturer. We have come across one or two very limited circumstances where a very small manufacturer of trailers essentially is buying tires from a local retailer up the street. So clearly Goodyear isn't going to know that the retailer up the street just sold a vehicle manufacturer 50 tires this year, but that retailer would be selling tires that had already been reported by Goodyear. So in that limited circumstance, what we've said is that if you're, for example, a trailer manufacturer, and you buy all of your tires from a local retailer, as opposed to from Goodyear head office, then please don't report those tires because they're already reported by Goodyear, for example. But that's a very limited set of circumstances. The ones, as the larger vehicle manufacturers, they have supply agreements with the Goodyears of the world, and so Goodyear knows that it's selling to a vehicle manufacturer or it's selling to a tire distributor, but they're able to keep track of that, and they report the ones that they sell to their distribution network, and the people that the ones that they sell to the vehicle manufacturers that they know about. They know that the vehicle manufacturers are going to report those, and that's the way the reg is set up.
And we might have someone who maybe join the call a little later. They just want some clarification. As a producer, how do I know how many tires I have to put back into the system? I suppose they're meaning how do I know what my collection target is?
As a producer?
Yes.
As a producer, when you come in and register and enter your supply data for 2014, 15, and 16, your collection target will be calculated, and it's the average of those 3 years times 0.85, and turns it into kilograms, and that's it. So you'll get a number on during the registration process, and make sure that you recognize that number, because if you've calculated a different number, then we need to have a call, and we'll sort it out if there's a difference. But entering in your supply data into the registry system produces a number at the end of registration saying this is your collection target.
From an auto importer, if we sell to a local auto part that sells our tires, who is the producer in the end?
So the person who actually brought those tires into Ontario is the producer. So if you were a person that imported some specialty tires into Ontario and then provided them to an auto part dealer who then went on to sell those, you are the producer, not the auto part dealer. It's the highest up the hierarchy that is the producer, not the end. And the reason for that is to make sure that there's no double reporting of tires. So the first person that's either resident in Ontario as the brand owner, or if there's no brand owner, the importer, or if there's no importer, the person who first markets them, that's the person who's responsible for the tires. And the only way that the auto part person would end up being a producer for the purposes of the regulation, is if they are the first resident person in Ontario to market those tires to a consumer in Ontario.
Okay. We have someone saying, if our data for 2014 to 2016 is zero, as we started selling in 2017, when do we need to meet our collection target?
If your collection target comes out as zero because of the supply information that you provide, then you don't have any collection target, and you don't have to worry about entering into a contract with a pro because there's nothing to do. So with that rolling average, if you're new to the market, because it's based on 3 years, let's say, for example, your first supply year where you actually supplied tires was in 2016. So you'd have zero for 2014, zero for 2015, and then some quantity of numbers of tires for 2016. Then that's divided by 3 to get the average, and there's a cutoff. If it's under 1,000 kilograms, there's no. If that average is under 1,000 kilograms, then obviously you're not going to have a collection target. Next year, you're going to have 1 0 and 2 real numbers, so your collection target is going to bump up. Maybe you're going to go over the 1,000 kilograms that year, and then you'll have a collection target. So it's really driven by your supply information. The first time your supply information generates an actual collection number that's above the threshold de minimis amount, that's when you have a responsibility to meet a target.
Now switching gears into the fee elimination, or the current stewardship fees that OTS charges. I'm a producer, and I have paid OTS the fee on all the tires that I have imported into Ontario, and I have some inventory. A lot of these tires that are in inventory will not be sold until sometime in 2019. If I supply them into 2019, they will be double counted for targets for 2019 when they are already in 2018 remittances.
So they won't actually be double counted for targets because the target is based on historical tire supply for our purposes. So whatever you have in inventory has got nothing to do with the collection targets. What you have in inventory was based on the OTS system and what OTS was charging its stewards and what stewards were doing with that fee to pass it through as part of the cost of their tires. The collection target for 2019 is based on historical supply data, simply to make it as reasonable possible a collection target that's based on the actual use of those tires and then starting to show up as used tires starting around 2019 and going forward, depending on how long it takes those tires to wear out. So they're not going to be double counted in targets. So there's no issue there. The OTS did not have mandatory targets to reach, and stewards didn't have individual targets that they were accountable for. That only starts in 2019, and the only tires that are being counted in that collection target are historical tires based on historical tire supply in 2014, 15, and 16.
The next question is, I am a retailer. Can a producer that I get my tires from for my consumers continue to charge me a fee after October 1st, such as they do now by charging $3.30 a tire?
Yeah, the October 1st deadline applies only to OTS and whether it can collect fees from stewards, and that's it. Whatever happens between producers and their customers is separate from that, and between now and the end of the year, if a steward, now a producer, wants to collect fees, of course, yes, they can do that. It's a question of business-to-business relationships and the competitive marketplace for tires that will drive all of that. And then starting in January 1st, as I said, we fully expect that will continue. The only issue is whether you make that cost visible to the consumer. If you make it visible to the consumer, then there's some consumer protection rules that kick in so that the consumer knows that it's a real charge being charged by producers to manage the end of life of those tires when they bring them back as used tires.
Now we have a new car dealer with the service department brings in a large quantity of winter tires in September, pays the OTS fee at the time of purchase. What happens when the dealer wants to return unsold product to point of purchase in January or February of next year? Will OTS be credited if the program ends this year?
So this has got nothing to do with OTS because all OTS is doing is collecting fees from stewards, and they're not allowed to do that after October 1st. What happens between the dealer and the dealer supplier is between the dealer and the dealer supplier. So if based on the contractual relationship you had relating to those tires that you're returning. So I look to your contract and get the advice from your lawyer on that one. That's not our issue.
And we do have time for some more questions. So if you have any that have just popped up, feel free to answer them on anything or ask them on anything we've discussed this morning. We have about 10 minutes left, and we're happy to stay and answer any further questions. We have more. This one's more of a comment, and it's around the incentives. And it says, if collectors are not getting an incentive, it may lead to dumping tires elsewhere if they're not collected on time.
Well, I really hope that collectors aren't going to engage in illegal activities by dumping tires, because that is actually a problem under a number of environmental statutes. I think the real thing that's happening behind this question is if I was getting some kind of an incentive for managing and holding used tires before they get picked up, am I still going to get something like that in the new world? And what I really want to emphasize is that there are two factors that are going to drive the answer towards very likely yes. That will continue. And those factors are, number one, individual producers now have mandatory collection targets. They have to meet that collection target, so they need tires. And number two, pros as the service providers have to meet their contractual relationships, and so they're going to be very, very motivated to make sure that they can collect enough tires to meet those contractual relationships. These tires have value now, and they are a resource, and they have value, and that value is going to be realized by people collecting them and then processing them to turn them into new products. So we don't believe that it's very likely that tires are going to accumulate so that people are going to engage in the illegal activity of dumping them somewhere. We think that those tires are going to have a value in the marketplace, and that people are going to want to collect those tires. And if that leads to something more than free pickup, including getting a price for them, I'm pretty sure that any collector who knows the tires are going to get picked up, even if they don't get paid for them, will be fine with that, because I think it's a bigger hassle to take those tires out into the woods somewhere to dump them than it is for them just to keep them here and let someone pick them up. So the marketplace is going to generate the response to this solution. The targets are aggressive, and obviously if it turns out, based on what we observe in the marketplace, that those targets turned out not to be aggressive enough, the ministry is going to be very motivated to tighten those up some more, because nobody wants to see tires getting dumped anymore.
Next question, what would happen if a producer cannot contract the service of a pro?
If a producer is unable to meet their target, they will be out of compliance. And beyond that, I don't think I would comment any further, because it would be really important to understand the circumstances that led to that result before you could make any comment about what would be the next step to do. I don't have a generic upfront answer that says this is what will actually happen. I think because we're a regulator, we have to know exactly why something happened in order to inform us as to what the right step is to take after that happens. There might be something really problematic in the marketplace that caused it, which might lead us on one path. It might be that the producers just can't be bothered doing the work that it takes to enter into a contract with a pro, which might take you in a different direction. It all depends on the circumstances of the situation, and we need to be very focused on why something happened before we say what will happen next.
And Final question, not final question. They keep coming in, which is great. We're happy that so many of you are asking such really great questions. As a first importer of new vehicles, we're a producer. However, if we are selling these vehicles out of the province, we do not need to report these tires. Is that correct?
That's right. The only tires that need to be reported are tires that are supplied into the Ontario marketplace, i.e. to a consumer in Ontario. So if they end up in the hands of a consumer somewhere else as new tires, they're not part of our system and may well be part of someone else's system.
Okay, and more of a comment than a question that says, as a private company, we need to recover recycling fees through either the tire price increases or extra charges on invoices. And it says, you've discouraged charging on invoices by making it extremely difficult, i.e. having an education program on an invoice and annual certified audit to follow your rules. The problem arises that the extra cost of the tire only applies if the tire is sold on a non-OEM and within Ontario. We need two different prices for tires, or we display an invoice, a separate line charge. It says it's going to be difficult for them to manage.
So the idea behind individual producer responsibility is that a producer who is supplying a product or packaging into the Ontario market is taking full responsibility for the entire life of that product so that it's priced appropriately to the consumer. The consumer buys the product knowing that that product will be taken care of when it's reached the end of its life in the form of that product, and the resources that are in it will be used and over again. So hence the circular economy. So in that context, I'm not sure how this issue arises, because once a product is being sold to a consumer in Ontario, you have a choice. You can break out the extra cost associated for dealing with that material in Ontario when it becomes used, or you can include it in the price. When Tim Hortons has an issue with the cost of beans going up, they're going to say the price of the coffee is going up because the price of the beans just went up, and if the cost of the tire requires it includes the cost of recycling, that's the cost of the tire, and that's in fact what we want. We want the cost to reflect the actual cost of that tire. That's the objective of the program, and so all that we're saying is that under the regulation, if you have a business decision that you can make, you can say, I'm going to separate this particular cost and none of the others, and that's fine. You can do that. But if you do, then the consumer is entitled to know what that cost is. I always go back to the airline example where a few years ago, people were starting to get really, really upset by the fact that airline companies would say, would advertise for a fare from Toronto to Vancouver, for example, for $100, and everybody get real excited, and then you'd go in and say, I'd like that $100 fare, but by the time you were finished, it was $500 because they would say, oh, well, there's this surcharge and these fees, and the customer, of course, is saying, well, wait, you told me it was going to be $100, and now it's $500, right? So that's an issue. That needs to be managed. If a consumer is being charged an extra fee for something, they're entitled to know what it's for and that it's a real fee. The other example that I always point to is that for many, many years, the cell phone providers had this line item on all of their bills saying $2, and they called it a regulatory charge. Well, there was no such thing. There was no regulatory charge there. They were just unbundling some of their costs and saying, here's the plan, it's $60 a month, and oh, by the way, we've got some extra fees to add on here, and it's $2, but it was a fake charge. So the idea here is that if you want to put an extra charge on the bill, it has to be a real charge, and the way everybody knows it's a real charge is because you can tell the consumer it's a real charge. You're saying, I'm putting this extra amount on your tire because Michelin is charging me an extra amount that I'm passing through to you, and it's being used for recycling this tire. That's a great message to the consumer if you want to make it visible, and that works. And if you don't want to make it visible, then that's fine too. But if you don't make it visible, then the consumer is now looking at the total cost of that tire and says, okay, I'm buying that tire for $110, and that's it, and they make their decision. Both are valid approaches. and you get to make the choice that you want to make. But the objective is to make sure that that cost of that tire is the total cost of that tire, and not just the cost that takes you up to the point where it gets thrown out. It's actually going to get reused.
On that note, I think we'll leave it there. Again, thank you to everyone who participated in today's webinar. If you wanted to join us tomorrow, you can find out the details on our website for how to register. And if not, if you want to review at a later date, we will let you know once a link to this recording and the presentation slides are posted on our website. Thank you very much, and have a good afternoon.
Thank you very much on my part, too.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us today. This does conclude our program. You may now disconnect.
Whew.